So last time we got it returning a color for us. This was easy to do, but it's a little bit annoying having to come back and forth between our Visual Studio Code and actual Unity if we want to change color. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this into a property. So if you go up to the properties block here, to define a property, you always do an underscore and then the property name. You also have to give it what the property's name is relative to the editor. So the editor will use this to determine how it should show it. And then the type is a color. And we just set this equal to, in brackets, let's do 1, 1, 1, 1. That's a base color and it's going to be white. You don't need a semicolon at the end of here. If you have a semicolon, it will give you an error. So make sure you don't have those. But if now we save this and we go to our material, you can see now we have a base color property up here. But it's not actually doing anything. So back in our code, what we need to do is where we have cbuffer start, cbuffer end. Within here, we're going to define a half-for. We're going to name it underscore base color. This just tells it to pull this property from our properties block and feed it to the GPU. The reason we're doing this in cbuffer start is because it's more performant when you have a bunch of these. The command buffer is able to pass a whole bunch of data at the same time to the GPU rather than doing them individually. So put anything that is either float, int, anything that way. If they're float 4s, float 3, anything that way, you can pass them through the command buffer. You just can't pass textures and samplers through the command buffer. Those have to be separate. So now that we've defined that here, if we instead go from returning this half-for, we go to return base color, save that, and go over. Now we have a material where we can actually control what color it is. So that's the basics of doing just a color property. Now, if say we want to make this an HDR color, we just need to add a tag in front and we change this. If we want to make this color emissive, we just add the tag HDR in front of the base color here. And then once we save that, we go back to Unity. Now this is an HDR color and we can make it be emissive. And then if say we want to add a different property in here called emission strength, we're going to find this and we're going to set it as a float for now. And let's set this to 1. Then in our command buffer, we'll define it as a half. And we'll multiply this by our emission strength. Save that. Now what I can do is I can increase or decrease this value to change the emission without actually changing the color. And if we wanted to, say, have this be a slider instead, we can go back to our property and instead of being float up here, we change it to capital R range. And within this range, we set between 0 and let's go with 5. Now we save that. Now in our material editor, we have a slider here that we can control. So that's the basics of how to use a property. One more thing I'm just going to show you quickly is how to define a texture, because textures are often very important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this base map. And this is going to be a 2D. And then with base maps, you need to tell them what type they are. There are a few different types. So defaults are white, black. Those are the easiest ones. It either returns a solid white texture or a solid black texture if it doesn't have something set for it. That just makes it so, if you're not using something for it, or if you don't have the material set, there is something there. And depending on the effect you're going for, you might want it to be black or white. There is also bump, which returns a flat normal map. But we're just going to do white. And then you want to do curly brackets before and after. And then now in here, we need to define our texture outside of the command buffer start. So we go texture 2D, and then we name it base map. And then we need a sampler. We do sampler underscore base map. You need to name this exactly like this, where it's the same name as the texture with sampler in front of the underscore. This links the two of them together. It's just needed for it to know what the sampler is for. Now, in the command buffer start, we're also going to have another half 4, and this is going to be named underscore base map underscore st. This is what determines the tiling and offset. So now if we instead in here, get rid of this, and we make a, let's do a half 3 actually. We name it color. So we want to call sample texture 2D. We're going to get base map, and then we want the sampler, and then we need to feed it in.uv. We can set that, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do color times base color times emission strength. So we have all of those. Whoops. Make sure if you're doing this here, you want it to be a half 4 in this case because it needs to return a half 4, and since I'm just multiplying by floats here, I can't just use a half 3. So now back in our scene, I've quickly just copied over a texture, and what we can do is we can apply this texture to our material. So now you'll see there is a base map property up here with tiling and offset, and I can just drag this texture up here. And now what it's doing is it's applying the texture to our object. And I can still control the brightness here. I can change the color. But if you look, when I do tiling 5, it's not doing anything. That's because we never actually told it to modify the UVs based off of this. So what we do now is instead of being in.uv for this, we're going to do in.uv times basemap st.xy plus basemap st.zw. So this is how we add that tiling and offset in. Now, if I save that and go back, if I set this to 5 and 5, you can see now the texture is becoming repeated on it. And that's the basics of how we define properties and sample a basic texture.